Hello, and welcome to the Watcher's review of The Web of Fear, a sequel to The Abominable Snowmen, and a foreshadowing of the shape of the show for years to come. Please be aware there are potential spoilers ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted for more content. After narrowly avoiding being sucked out of the TARDIS into space-time vortex following on from the conclusion of the previous story, Enemy of the World, the Doctor, Victoria and Jamie landed in an abandoned London Underground station covered in a web-like substance that had previously trapped the TARDIS in space. Before too long, the Doctor finds himself up against the Yeti and the Great Intelligence as they ravage through London. Out of all the actors to have played the Doctor, Patrick Troughton is arguably the most influential, in that his portrayal laid the blueprint to allow any actor to create their own spin on the character, whilst maintaining echoes of the characteristics of their predecessors. While it is now common practice, it was a leap into the unknown for both Troughton and the production team when he took over from William Hartnell in 1966. However, Troughton perfected it and helped create the key to the show's longevity. Additionally, Troughton developed wide-ranging layers to his incarnation, ranging from being a Chaplin-esque clown, cunning schemer, to warm friendliness. Depending on the stories, the layers of these characteristics were adjusted, and here you perhaps see the cunning schemer at its most prevalent. Seemingly warm and dismissive at first about the web that has entrapped the TARDIS, he then portrays the standard of curiosity of all the Doctors by exploring the London Underground whilst trying to maintain Jamie and Victoria's safety. Through his curiosity, he comes across the presence of the Yeti before disappearing for the whole of episode 2. This absence establishes the beginnings of the Doctor exploring the London Underground alone and establishing why the Yeti are present and the anticipated presence of the Great Intelligence, as well as the Doctor meeting Colonel Lethbridge-Stewart, later to be known as the Brigadier. During the 60s stories, it was common practice for the main cast to be absent during particular episodes due to the recording schedule and actors taking holidays. Normally their characters' absence is established with them being unconscious or captured, but due to the character development created by Troughton and Haseman and Lincoln's writing, the Doctor's absence heightens his mystery and cunning, while simultaneously allowing the heavy cast of characters to develop. Once reintroduced in episode 3, the Doctor becomes embroiled in the distrust of characters amongst each other, knowing full well the capabilities of the Great Intelligence, being able to inhabit any human as a host, and knowing all too well that this is how the Yeti are getting one step ahead of the army. The Doctor also shows his aloofness compared to the military, whilst also focusing on the power of science by teaming up with Professor Travers and his daughter Anne in establishing a way of turning the tables on the Great Intelligence. It is eventually revealed that the Great Intelligence wants the Doctor's mind and his knowledge of time travel. From here, the Doctor has to use his guile and secret plotting in order to defeat the Great Intelligence and not put any of his friends at risk, but all the time knowing, or not knowing, who the Great Intelligence is using as a host and keeping his plans of sabotage hidden. Jamie was by now the established companion, having made his debut in the second Doctor's second story, The Highlanders, and this shows with him being now experienced in the Doctor's adventures and being very protective over the lesser experienced companion Victoria. Due to this, the pair remain together once separated from the Doctor during episode 1, and are soon reunited with Professor Travers, who featured in The Abominable Snowmen, but in the course of the Doctor's absence, Jamie then becomes involved with the army and heavily involved in the scenes in the underground tunnels, and spends a considerable amount of time with the soldier Evans. Towards the end of the story, Jamie becomes one of the select few who the Doctor trusts not to be under control of the Great Intelligence, and as such, he is heavily involved in the story's conclusion in stopping their plan. Although Jamie gets plenty of screen time in the story, it is mostly set wandering around the underground tunnels and confronting the Yeti. However, this isn't to say Jamie doesn't have anything to do in the story, but more the case of there being a large number of key characters that it is necessary for the three lead characters to be separated from the majority of the story in order to act as the lead in their respective scenes and in order to keep the audience engaged. This was Victoria Waterfield's penultimate story, having been a companion since the previous season's final story, Evil of the Daleks. As an orphan teenager from the Victorian era, she has a sense of vulnerability and easily gets frightened, and having the notoriety of screaming a lot. Despite this, she is inquisitive and will often lend herself to overhear things other characters, in particular antagonists, are plotting. Due to her being the lesser experienced companion, the Doctor acts as a sort of guardian to her in the absence of her father, while Jamie is very protective of her, and you get the impression at times he fancies her. Like Jamie, in The Web of Fear, she spends a lot of time separated from the other two lead characters, initially being with Professor Travers and his daughter Anne when she overhears them privately doubting the Doctor and contemplating him being involved with the Yeti. Later, she wanders the underground alone, which heightens the fear and concern for her from the audience perspective given her general vulnerable state, and being alone in the tunnels lurking with the Yeti and mysterious web and fungus spreading throughout the network. However, although she portrays this frightened, innocent young girl figure, this shouldn't detract her from her bravery, or stupidity depending on your way of thinking, of wandering through the tunnels in search of the Doctor, who is missing, and eventually finding him with Colonel Lethbridge-Stewart. Later on in the story, the Great Intelligence uses Victoria as a form of blackmail for the Doctor to surrender himself by taking her hostage while controlling Professor Travers. This draws back to the stereotypical outline of many of the female companions of this era of Doctor Who, as being the one who gets captured by the antagonist. Generally, in the story, she has very little to do. However, as previously mentioned, this is more down to allowing more characters to have the opportunity to develop. This is Professor Travers' second adventure, having debuted early in the season with the Abominable Snowmen. Whilst in his first story he portrayed an explorer and anthropologist in his late 30s to early 40s, here, in The Web of Fear, he portrays an elderly man due to this story taking place roughly 40 years after its predecessor. He starts the story by visiting an antique dealer called Julius Silverstein, who years earlier he had sold one of the robot Yetis to on his return from Tibet. His reasoning is due to him losing one of the controlling spheres, which he had also obtained from Tibet, and becoming concerned about the Yeti becoming reactivated. Although unsuccessful in buying back the Yeti, his suspicions are confirmed when the missing sphere reactivates the Yeti, which then kills Silverstein. Later on, Travers and his daughter Anne have been hired by the army as scientific advisors as to investigate the reasoning of the Yeti appearing in the London Underground. When reunited with Jamie and Victoria, he can't believe himself, since they haven't aged, and he has, and furthermore becomes more enthusiastic, knowing that the Doctor is also present in the Underground. During the Doctor's absence in episode 2, Travers becomes a Doctor-like figure and becoming the expert in what is happening in the Underground, and at times gives off vibes of William Hartnell, with him being grumpy and cantankerous. Upon being reunited with the Doctor, he admitted to keeping possession of one of the spheres, and after years of tinkering with it, he accidentally reactivated it, thus giving the Great Intelligence a signal to home in on. Despite this, he leaves a lot of the science and techno stuff to his daughter Anne and the Doctor. Like the Abominable Snowmen, Travers here is played by Jack Watling, who is the father of Deborah Watling, who plays Victoria. Naturally, to show how the character has aged over the years, the actor has had makeup applied and behaves like an elderly man. I haven't seen the Abominable Snowman, but I'm assuming that Watling purposely plays the character somewhat differently due to his elderly age. As previously mentioned, Anne Travers is Professor Travers' daughter, having also been hired by the army as a scientific advisor. Anne, in many respects, is a modern woman compared to the stereotypical view of women in the 60s. She holds a respectable job and repels any jibes or quips from the soldiers about how she became to be a scientist. Initially suspicious of the Doctor when he has disappeared, she then works alongside him as a sort of stand-in companion due to Jamie and Victoria's lack of scientific understanding. She then plays an important role in helping the Doctor reprogram a Yeti. Due to her purpose in the story, Anne inadvertently becomes a prototype of Liz Shaw, given her no-nonsense reactions, quips about being a scientist, and her ability to assist the Doctor on the scientific level. The Web of Fear marked the debut of Colonel Lethbridge-Stewart, who later becomes known in Doctor Who as the Brigadier. His backstory in the Web of Fear is that he is one of two survivors, along with Driver Evans, who survived the Yeti ambush and is left wandering the London Underground, where he meets and captures the Doctor off-screen during episode 2. Once establishing the presence of the army in the Underground, Lethbridge-Stewart takes control of the situation based on his rank, although his sudden emergence arouses suspicion when the characters work out that one of them is perhaps under the control of the Great Intelligence. However, despite this uncertainty, Lethbridge-Stewart still seems to believe the Doctor's theories and backstory, or at least willing to put it to the test when the characters start to become uncertain of him. He later leads a group of soldiers in fighting off the Yeti, and narrowly ends up being the sole survivor of the conflict. His presence and assertiveness quickly elevates his character to prominence, given that he is only introduced in episode 3. His bravery and willingness not to take things at face value set him out differently from the rest of the military characters, and his chemistry with the lead characters and his survival at the end of the story planted the seed for producer Peter Bryant and script editor Derek Sherwin to bring the character back in the next season's story, The Invasion, with him being promoted as Brigadier, and the rest, we know, is history. The Web of Fear has a group of characters who've had more added depth than guest characters tended to have in Doctor Who stories, and as such, I could have gone into depth on some more of these characters, in particular Staff Sergeant Arnold, Driver Evans, and Harold Chorley. Arnold is an old-hand experienced sergeant who held the respect of all his fellow soldiers, and despite his age, is still willing to jump into action as a brave stalwart soldier and lead by example, and expects every other soldier to carry on with the mission and not give in to desertion. Driver Evans is another soldier who was found roaming the underground and seemingly represents the voice of initial reason and logic, despite being somewhat selfish in his own views. Unlike the rest of the soldiers, his primary concern is escape and self-survival, and as such, behaves more like a scared civilian than a soldier, although it is implied that due to his job as a driver, he doesn't see as much action as other soldiers. He spends a lot of the story with Jamie in the tunnels trying to find a way out, and when the Great Intelligence demands that the Doctor turns himself over, Evans is quick to suggest giving up the Doctor so the others can survive. Harold Chorley is the only reporter attached to the investigation of the ongoings in the London Underground. Initially acting like a typical journalist, he seems to take an interest in everyone, in particular any other civilian that becomes involved, such as the Professor and Anne Travers, and then the Doctor, Jamie and Victoria. His investigation techniques lead him to establish theories about everyone. However, when it becomes clear that he has become trapped with everyone else in the underground due to the Yeti and the spreading fungus, he panics and attempts to flee and subsequently disappears for about a third of the story, before appearing towards the climax. The Great Intelligence returns along with the Yeti and is the main antagonist of the story, and is described by the Doctor as a formless, shapeless thing floating out in space, and as such relies on using human bodies as hosts. Due to this, part of the story revolves around who is controlled by the Great Intelligence and sabotaging the mission from within and giving itself and the Yeti an advantage. At various stages, the Doctor, Professor Travers, Lethbridge-Stewart, Arnold, Evans and Chorley are all suspected of being the saboteur due to their knowledge of the Great Intelligence or their tendency to disappear at key stages of the story. The Great Intelligence makes a physical appearance at the end of episode 4, in possession of Professor Travers' body, although it admits Travers being a temporary solution, and the true person under their control is still a mystery until the closing stages of episode 6, which, for the sake of spoilers, I won't reveal. It confesses to the Doctor that it trapped the TARDIS in a web-like substance to force the situation in bringing the Doctor to the London Underground to set him up in the trap of the Yeti and the fungus taking over. Having been in awe of the Doctor's knowledge and capabilities from their previous confrontation in the abominable snowmen, the Great Intelligence wishes to absorb the Doctor's mind and not, as the Doctor presumed, act on revenge. Other than the revelation of the traitor from within that the Great Intelligence took possession of, their only presence in the story is a voice through a speaker. This adds to the mysterious nature and threat of the Great Intelligence, and for a lot of the story, their menace is implied rather than witnessed firsthand, either by using their hosts secretly to sabotage events, or controlling the Yeti and the fungus and their control of the London Underground. Where the Great Intelligence is an implied threat, the Yeti carry the purpose of being the actual threat in the story. As it was with the abominable snowmen, the Yetis are actually robots controlled by the Great Intelligence to do their bidding. In the Web of Fear, they are equipped with guns that emit a web-like substance with the capability of killing humans and even preventing explosives from going off. The design of the Yeti this time has been modified, with their fur becoming more trimmed down and the addition of glowing eyes and a mouthpiece, which in reality acted as a means for the actors to see where they were going. The modification would have both to make them look more menacing and less teddy bear-like, and more practical for the actors who performed in the suits. However, in my opinion, their true menace comes from the roar that they gave off, which heightens their scare factor. Something that, if it was absent, would have greatly reduced the threat that they carried out on screen. The Web of Fear was written, like its companion story The Abominable Snowmen, by Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln. While it would have been easy to have written a sequel to their first story by simply taking the same plot and putting it in a different setting, they instead decide to see what else they can apply to the antagonist they created. In this case, they apply the Great Intelligence and the Yeti in the present day and into a setting that is more familiar and identifiable to the audience, i.e. the London Underground. This in turn brings the threat of aliens and monsters close to home, and while it's still science fiction, it taps into the consciousness of the younger viewer who might be believing into it being real. This wasn't a new idea to Doctor Who, with it first being applied in the Dalek invasion of Earth, with Daleks roaming around London, the War Machines set in contemporary London, and the Faceless Ones set in Gatwick Airport. However, the Web of Fear turns this up a notch and sets out a formula that will be reused in Doctor Who for years to come. Another difference in the approach of writing the Web of Fear is that it is both a story set in an under siege situation, but also an enemy within. This assisted in the outline of the story being essentially split into two sections. Episodes 1 to 3 sets about introductions of the characters in the story. In extension to 3 lead characters, you are introduced with Professor Travers early while introduced to Anne in the same scene. You are then introduced to the soldiers already in the underground, including Arnold and Captain Knight, as well as the reporter Chorley, all of which happens in episode 1. The Doctor's absence in episode 2 allows these characters to interact before introducing Driver Evans and then Colonel Lethbridge-Stewart by episode 3. For the second half of the story, the underground has become a claustrophobic labyrinth due to the Yeti and fungus taking over, and when the internal sabotaging starts happening, the characters have growing uncertainty and suspicion of one another due to knowing the characteristic traits and their notable absences. This pacing allows the story to create texture and backstory to a lot of the characters and give the audience a broad sense of variety. This couldn't be achieved, however, without the absence of key characters such as the Doctor and Evans and Lethbridge-Stewart's later introductions, but due to Haseman and Lincoln's writing skills, character absence is as important as character presence in this story. Douglas Camfield, by now, was one of the most experienced hands amongst Doctor Who production, having been involved since the first story, An Unearthly Child, as production assistant, and having fully directed 3 stories during the William Hartnell era. The Web of Fear was his first of 2 stories he directed during the Patrick Troughton era, and by now his talents are in full flow. Camfield has this ability of making the story look cinematic in the use of camera angles and leaving the viewer to establish what happens during what you don't see. A prime example of this is at the beginning of the story when a Yeti is reactivated in Silverstein's dark, shadowy house. The Yeti emerges out of nowhere to strike and you would assume kill Silverstein. However, all you get is the scared look on Silverstein's face, followed by a low-angle shot of the Yeti striking towards the camera in what you assume is Silverstein's perspective. Minimal, but powerful at the same time. Camfield also maximises David Mysco Jones's set design work by using Ealing Studios, which is a lot larger, to give deeper shots of the underground. Due to British Rail forbidding the use of the actual London Underground, Mysco Jones recreated the tunnels and platform in the studio from wood. Complete with lighting leaving a lot of darkness and shadow, and the footwear on metal sound effects added in post-production that were so effective, British Rail were rumoured to have double-checked with the BBC to ensure that they hadn't used the real London Underground. Further miniature shots of the fungus progressing through the tunnels were achieved using the BBC's puppet theatre at television studios. The offset offices used by the army in the underground were filmed at BBC Lime Grove Studios, which were known for being small and cramped, and this is shown to be even smaller when you have multiple characters occupying the space at one given time, thus further highlighting the claustrophobic, entrapped feeling the story creates. The only on-location shots were done in parts of London such as Covent Garden during the battle between the soldiers and the Yetis on the street surfaces. As was the norm during 1960s Doctor Who, the soundtrack music is compiled here as stock music, but kept to a minimum. Used primarily at the start to create atmosphere by use of orchestral music, and once again during the Yeti battle sequences, where a familiar piece of music used for the Cybermen in their first 3 stories was here reused. However, credit should go to Brian Hodgson and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, who replaced the absence of music with eerie sound effects, either it be bubbling noises of the expanding fungus, the roar of the Yeti, or the sting-like sounds to highlight a shock moment. The absence of music also helps in allowing the show to develop dialogue and use echo, in particular when characters are in the tunnels. Since this story has a missing episode, it is only available for viewing and completion with the use of 2 methods. When the majority of the story was recovered back in 2013, the only missing episode, episode 3, was put together for DVD release with the use of telesnaps and the soundtrack in place. Not too dissimilar to how you are watching this video right now. The 2021 DVD release involved the use of animation, which had become the norm for recreating lost episodes of the Hartnell and Troughton era. With the Web of Fear, the animation work was undertaken for the first time by Shapeshifter Studios, with a noticeable difference in quality compared to the early animated efforts. In my opinion, I feel the animation looks like it's out of a computer game from the PlayStation 2 era, and some of the characters' likenesses are questionable. The DVD offers both a black and white and colour version of the episode, which I personally don't quite understand, given that the surviving episodes are in black and white, and to switch from black and white to colour and back to black and white is a strange experience. In the past, colour and black and white options have been available for stories that have been entirely recreated, which works, instead of the solitary episode we have here. In my opinion though, the animation just edges it in my preference to watching this story, although I go with the black and white option. My reasoning is that although telesnaps give an insight to how the episode looked, they just do that, and you become disengaged, and this method loses the pace of the story. I am a big fan of episodes being recreated with animation, but feel that if Shapeshifter Studios are going to have to do more animation for missing stories, then they should look at this as a test in the water phase and up the quality on any future stories they may do. The Web of Fear was broadcast from the 3rd of February to the 9th of March 1968 as the 5th story of Season 5. To me, a great story consists of great storytelling, great acting, and great direction. To me, a great story consists of great storytelling, great acting, and great direction. and a bad story comes about when one or more of these attributes fails miserably. Good stories can at times get away with reduction in quality in one of these attributes, but a great story performs highly on them all, and the Web of Fear is definitely one of them. Haseman and Lincoln put together a storyline full of mystery, atmosphere and suspense, while simultaneously progressing their own created antagonist. Due to script writing, the actors are given space and opportunity to push their roles as believable people, and as such draws the audience into the story even more. One of the biggest challenges that the production team faced in the classic era of Doctor Who was budget restrictions, and in partnership with the design team, the art of a good director is making the show look a higher quality than the budget it worked off. And not only does Douglas Adams pull this off, but his meticulous direction elevates the Web of Fear to almost film-like status. In short, the Web of Fear is perhaps one of the best examples of how 1960s Doctor Who should be done. Not only is the Web of Fear one of the strongest stories in Doctor Who's history, it is also one of the most important. As previously mentioned, the character of Colonel Lethbridge-Stewart made an impression and was given further expansion in The Invasion. The use of the army in the Web of Fear in effect became the blueprint of Unit, which also debuted in The Invasion, and use of familiar settings in the present day showed its extra effectiveness in providing suspense and threat for the audience, and it shows its worth. In short, the Web of Fear sets out the blueprint of the Jon Pertwee era overall. Douglas Camfield would later return in the year to direct The Invasion, and then directing Inferno from Jon Pertwee's debut season, before taking a 5-year absence from the show, only to return in 1975 to direct Terror of the Zygons and The Seeds of Doom for the Tom Baker era, before ending his 13-year association with Doctor Who. Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln, however, had less joy with their association with Doctor Who. Their next submission was the Season 6 opening story, The Dominators, which, due to extensive changes made to the story, led them to requesting their names removed from the script and replaced with the pseudonym of Norman Ashby. Additionally, they had planned a third story featuring the Great Intelligence and the Yeti, which would have seen as a return to 1746 Scotland when Jamie first joined the TARDIS crew, and lead to his eventual departure. However, this story proposal was withdrawn after the duo had a disagreement with the BBC over the ownership of comic strip representation of their creations. As such, Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln never wrote again for Doctor Who, which is unfortunate given their obvious talent for character design. As for the Great Intelligence and the Yeti, they weren't to appear again in the classic era, with the exception of the Yeti making a cameo appearance in The Five Doctors, and together with the Great Intelligence appearing in the independently made film Downtime in the 1990s, which was based on one of the Missing Adventure novels. Fortunately, the Great Intelligence was brought back to the show in 2012 with the Christmas special The Snowmen, having now been played by Ian McKellen and Richard E. Grant, and later appearing in subsequent stories The Bells of St. John and The Name of the Doctor, in which Stephen Moffat manages to add further development and backstory to the antagonist. As of 2021 though, we are yet to see the return of the Yeti. So, that concludes my review of the Web of Fear. Of course, it is only my opinion, so feel free to express your own in the comments if you think differently. Be sure to tune in for my next video, but if you do have a suggestion for a story for me to review, then just let me know. But remember, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.